Good morning. My name is Xavier Easy, and I want to share a sermon that I put together with you today. So, the sermon is called It's Not the Seed. I'm going to start by reading a passage. If you'd like to join me, please turn with me to the book of 1 Samuel. And I'm going to be reading chapter 13, verses 7 through 10. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. It came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. So this passage is critical because it's setting in the book of Samuel is when we see God shift his favor from Saul to David. And it pretty much shows us a little snippet of what not to do and like how you can lose God's favor or end up outside of his blessing and his promises. This passage weaves together historical narrative with some prose discourse, and it does it in a manner that makes you really feel for Saul. It makes you feel for the antagonist, if you could even call him that. There's different opinions on that. And then it stretches the cognitive dissonance because later on, right after that passage, in the next following verses, God's judgment by Samuel, like right after Saul did that, causes him to lose the kingship. So you're like, well, what would I do in that situation versus, well, God isn't wrong. So yeah, the whole book of First Samuel's filled. It's got an ensemble cast. You got Saul, David, Jonathan, Samuel, just to name a few. It was written either during Solomon's era, during the Solomonic era. Could have been written around 700 BC when Hezekiah was king, or during the exile to Babylon. But we know that it's written on works. It's based on works written by Samuel and Nathan. Personally, I subscribe to what the Jewish tradition believes, which is that it was written during the Solomonic era. So the passage I just read takes place around 2 years after Saul has taken the throne as Israel's first king, because the people really wanted a king, and so they got one. And it's about 1,000 years before Christ, give or take 20 years. So Israel has enemies everywhere during this time period. There's nothing new under the sun. They still have enemies everywhere. But at this point in time, they're still facing oppression by the Philistines. And the 12 tribes of Israel are like geographically disjointed and cut off because the Philistine military is pretty much like in their territory. I guess a example, and this may not be perfect, but like if you think about how there's like kind of two governments in Mexico, there's like the drug cartels, and then there's the actual Mexican government, and they like overlap in territory, and so there's skirmishes. Sort of like that. I mean, that's not a perfect example, but that's the best modern example I can think of, or modern Israel, I guess, as well, still kind of. So, but anyway, that's like based on the fact that the tribes are scattered and Israel's has enemies all over the place. From Saul's perspective, he has a great deal to prove at this point. So this is what Israel and Saul both kind of think that God sent him to the seat of to do, was to kick some butt, take some names, be the hero. That's what they think, at least. So Jonathan, Saul's son, actually launches a surprise attack, like a guerrilla style surprise attack on the Philistine garrison, and that pretty much like starts a war. The Philistines were really, like angry. And it's funny because it was an attack that Saul promptly took credit for. The Philistines did not like this one bit. They didn't like it at all, not even a little bit. And they amount like a massive army to respond to this like terrorist attack, kind of in their eyes. And in the face of this massive army, which the Bible refers to as like a multitude, it's in this circumstance that Saul is facing this trial where his heart and his leadership are tested in the passage at hand that I just read, and he does not pass the test. So upon closer study of the passage, there's a few things that add context from the original Hebrew that I think are really worth pointing out. So from verse 7, where Saul's men followed him trembling, the Hebrew word there for trembling is sharad or harad. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I haven't taken class yet. I'm procrastinating it, trying to wait until my last semester, my master's degree. I don't like languages that much. But anyway, sharad, harad. In other places of the Bible, it translates as routed, actually. So that's a term you'll hear thrown a lot in military circles. Routed is actually when like an army gives up the fight and sort of just turns around and like runs for their lives because they think they're going to die, and like the unit cohesion just breaks down. There's no chain of command. It's every man for himself. It's not good. So there were people from Saul's army that were already doing that during the time period. During the time period of this battle, when that passage is being read, just imagine there's a battlefield and people are running around all over the place. Everybody's panicked, including Saul. But the word sharad is actually used as a description of the men who followed Saul to Gilgal. And I think that's important because it shows that even though they're following him within their hearts, they're checked out. They are mentally and spiritually and emotionally checked out. And I think that's important for the context because so is Saul. So in verse 8, where Saul is described as having tarried, he's waiting for the prophet Samuel to come. The word for tarried there is yahal. Interestingly, in other parts of the Bible, that very same word is actually used to mean hoped or trusted. So in the book of Job, Job uses the word in a context where he actually does what one might think God wanted Saul to do in this circumstance. And this is Job. I'm going to read real quick. This is Job chapter 13, verse 15 in the New American Standard Version. He slay me, I will hope in him nevertheless. And this is Job talking about God because he's enduring some pretty rough trials right now. And here's the verse again in the King James Version, which is the best version of the Bible. Though it's actually the version that Jesus used. So this is the KJV of that same verse. This is Job chapter 13, verse 15. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. So just a question to throw to the floor. When is the appointed time to trust God end? Because don't forget, this word, Yahal, is, which in this passage is being used as tarried, translates to hoped and trusted. So he waited 7 days, right? And then all of a sudden he's like, okay, I can do the sacrifice now. My time to wait is done. I get to check the box. That's what Saul is saying in this circumstance. But like, just if you switch that word for like some of its other translations and it's the same Hebrew word, you start to see a little bit when it's unpacked, it looks a little bit different. So when does the appointed time to trust God end? When does the appointed time to hope in God end? When does that end? Saul's decision to depart from tarrying, from waiting, from hoping after the 7 days has passed and he gets to check the box. When you swap the word out for the Hebrew, it actually better reflects his true heart posture. Here's another one from verse 8 still. According to the time set, translates to moed in the Hebrew. So Saul waited only the bare minimum, according to when Samuel was supposed to be there, based off of Saul's own opinion, by the way. If I'm driving to meet somebody for dinner and I was supposed to be there at 7, or they were supposed to be there at 7, and one of us is 5 minutes late, we don't just, maybe some people, but like me, and I hope whoever I'm getting dinner with, who's in my friend circle, wouldn't just leave the restaurant after 5 minutes, much less so if the person was God's prophet, like, by nature, you can't explain things. It does not behoove us to box God into a set time or to try to test the judge against his own law. And then you might ask the question, well, what if there's like a crazy battle going around and I'm going to lose my life and I don't know if I'm going to die? Well, then you should probably trust God more. That's probably I think it works even more in the favor of like, that's probably the time the most, so adding context as to the mental state of this army, is the translation of Saul's people being scattered from him. And the word here is putst. It's Puwts if you want to Google it and look it up in the Hebrew, because I might have butchered it just now. But Saul's army, including him and reflective of him, were shaken to pieces. That's one of the translations for the word putst, and scattered. So what we draw them with is what we draw them to. Someone taught me that a really long time ago. I don't remember if it was in ministry or if it was just a conversation. But Saul drew people to himself as a leader instead of to God. Unlike Gideon was even one of the judges in the book of Judges. Gideon was a coward, but he was a coward with faith, and he drew people. He didn't have a lot, but he drew people to the Lord instead of himself. And Saul, who's in a very similar situation to Gideon, where their armies are just completely outclassed by their enemy. Saul drew people to himself, forgetting that God was present for Israel. And, he must have known about the story of Gideon, because that had happened already, where God said, fight the bad guys with a smaller army so that I get glory and you don't. And they won. But Saul didn't do that in this situation. So another word in verse 8 is the word al. And that's the word from him, when Saul's troops rout and scatter. And it translates in Hebrew in other parts of the Bible. Actually, most commonly it translates as above him, as though like somebody's above you, and also like from off of somebody, like away and above is sort of what it implies. So this at least to me, it linguistically indicates that there's something about the particular frame of this situation that I think would be missed in English if it was just like, in Saul's troops scattered from him versus in Saul's troops scattered as though they were above him, or as though they were like from off of him. I think it actually rings a little bit different. And I think of like the chain of command in the military. And it seems as though the authority in this scene has flipped out of the favor of Saul. It's like Saul's army is not even viewing him as the leader, despite having the rank of king, literally. And this happens in the U.S. Army all the time. Like I'm a second lieutenant, but in terms of like commanded respect, like a staff sergeant who technically I outrank is like in a sense above me, in terms of respect. And in terms of like respect and the authority that they would command, because of their wisdom and lived experience. Depending on what they do, but for the most part, like I'm going to take what an E6 has to say, or someone else is going to take what an E6 has to say a lot more seriously than they're going to take what me as like an O1 has to say. So like rank is not everything. And I think just sort of seeing that play out in the situation. And I think that's why the above him thing adds more context than just from him in the English. So because it looks like Saul's lost the respect of his military. It looks like because of Saul's demeanor, he's all like, oh, he's all like, he's spazzing out and everything. Because of that, the people around him, when their lives are on the line, they sort of looked down on him. At least that's what it seems like in the Hebrew. So this is one of the translations of one of the words from verse 9. Bring hither a burnt offering to me. The word used in the Hebrew there, to me, translates el. In other places of the Bible, it actually translates as against, or as will be for. So like bring a burnt offering against me, or bring a burnt offering like as it will be for me. Or some of the ways that you could translate that. And it was most as he, Saul was specifically commanded by Samuel to wait for Samuel to do the offering. So it was not for him at all. Some people make the argument that like Saul wasn't king, so he's not supposed to make a burnt offering. But David did that later on and didn't get punished for it. So I don't think that's exactly why God has a problem with Saul doing this. But I think it's specifically because Saul was told not to do it. Specifically, he got a direct order from God to wait for Samuel. So when he did it, he wasn't bringing the burnt offering to him as it's translated in English, but like one could say he's bringing it against himself because it's not meant for him. Actually, here's an example of how this word is used in Genesis 4:8, when Cain rose up against Abel and he slew his brother. I think that in the same context, Saul was sort of rising up against God because he valued the war and alleviating his own fear by his own hands and his own means more than the trust in his relationship with God. Saul never got to make the peace offering actually, because Samuel arrives in like right after the burnt offering, but before the peace offering. And I think Samuel might have actually saved Saul's life, because I think that if Saul had tried to offer or successfully offered the peace offering, God would have killed him. I really do believe God would have killed him. One, because we're still in the Old Testament, and Jesus has not been on; he's not on the scene yet. So there's God seems to there's no lamb to soak up God's wrath in a lot of these. There's grace, yet people are getting smited with like lightning a lot more often in this time period because Jesus hasn't arrived on the scene yet. So I actually think that God would have killed Saul if he did this, because Saul would have literally been breaking a treaty and like a direct order from God. He would have been violating God's law in his face with ignorance and audacity, trying to make a peace treaty. And I think that Saul's distrust for God under the surface and the lack of fear for God in comparison to the Philistines, to think that he could go and make a peace offering before the Lord when he got a direct order to not do that. It's not peace, that's fear. And I think it's not just disrespectful to fear the Philistines more than he fears God, but it's existentially dangerous to him and the whole army he's leading. God could have wiped them all out. That's not, and I don't say this to insult God or to say that he's like a bully with a magnifying glass, but like he will be proven holy. That's totally not outside the realms of like getting smitten for. So I actually think Samuel saved Saul's life and might have saved the whole army's life by stopping Saul before the peace offering was made. So it's not just a casual thing. Saul really did he deserves to be removed as king, in my opinion, because he almost got the army killed. I think, at least, that's my hypothesis, but I think it's a good argument, at least. So here we go. We're just continuing. And the burnt offering. The word offered in that sentence translates as Allah. So in most translations, the word translates as went up, like as to like ascend. And one could make a case that only the prophet was supposed to do that. The king's not supposed to go up to talk to God and to be the, I guess, intermediary. Because God is holy and he'll be proven holy. And he killed Aaron's sons for like not doing, some of the religious ceremonies correctly. So people like died for not doing the religious ceremonies correctly in that time period. So it's dangerous to do these things. It's still dangerous to do these things today, even in like 1 Corinthians, and you can look this up in your own time. But in 1 Corinthians, Paul like tells the Corinthians that the reason that some of them are sinning is because they're taking communion without repenting. So like, just pro tip, like if you're going to take communion, repent first, because genuinely, and this is New Testament, this is not Old Testament, you can die. God will kill you. I mean, he's going to be proven holy. He's a God. You can't just, disrespect him to his face and, expect it to be, peaches and cream. So just continuing, yeah, he killed Aaron's sons for doing for doing something similar to that. And I think that the lack of fear for the Lord here is worth mentioning. But I think that the point was that Saul went up when he was supposed to be going down. And I mean that in terms of like heart posture. I think that Saul's test was that if he was going to try to save his own life, or if he was going to lay it down for the sake of trusting God. Was he going to try to grab his life at the last second, or was he going to like let God be the one to save him? And he's the leader of Israel. Is he going to try to save Israel himself, or is he going to let God be the one to save Israel? And once he makes the decision to try to save his own life, that's exactly when Samuel appears. So in the same way, how once he decided to save his own life, Samuel appeared. I think that was the test. If I was a betting man, I would bet that if he had surrendered his life to God and been like, God, like, I don't understand, Samuel's not here, but like you said it was going to happen, so I trust you. If he had surrendered his life into God's hands, I think Samuel would have appeared at that very moment as well. I think that really was the test. Was he going to surrender his life to God's hands, or was he going to, trust religion over relationship? So the account of Saul's choice here that causes God to turn his back on him becomes even more convicting of Saul, as well as of our own sin, the more historical, cultural, and geographical data is unpacked from the account. The deeper we look, the more we see that it's not just meta story, which is like a story that's applicable for everyone's life and everyone could learn something from it. Like The Boy Who Cried Wolf is meta story because we've all been there at the point. That's an example of what meta story is. It's like a story that's so real and so true that every human being could understand it. So I don't think it's just meta story, but I think it's also applicable to us in our everyday lives. In addition to reflecting like actual historical events. And it's one of the reasons I say it's applicable and not just meta story is because the less slack we can, it's uncomfortable. The less slack we can spare Saul, the more we dig into the situation. The less slack we can spare ourselves because we make a lot of the same mistakes that Saul does here. So geographically, Gilgal, where Saul picked to set up camp, happened to be the furthest from the Philistine camp that he could physically go with his military without crossing the Jordan River, which was behind him. And I think that that's reflecting his attitude about the battle and his trust of God. Like, imagine there's two boxers in the ring, and one of them's like in the center of the ring, ready to go, and the other one's like backed up into the corner, like for now. Like, that's sort of what he's doing with his army physically, with the Jordan to his back. We actually see Israelites, interestingly enough, distinguished as Hebrews in the text, in the context of this passage, running across the Jordan, fleeing. It's like an insult to them in the text. It's kind of calling them yellow-bellied cowards, which I think is kind of funny, is that they don't call them Israelites when they're running away across the Jordan. They call them Hebrews. And the crossing of the Jordan in the Bible, it carries with it like heavy ritualistic and ideological implications. So we see God even part the Jordan River when Israel's going into the Promised Land under Joshua, and memorialize it with like the Ark of the Covenant being across. It's like this whole big thing, and it's archetypal in its significance. It's sort of like the idiom of the crossing of the Rubicon, like you're going into a new place, into a new era, and there's no going back. It's a paradigm shift, in a sense, a no turning back point. But here we see Israel going the wrong way across the river, and if that is not prophetic for what happens with like Saul's whole leadership, if that is not reflective of Saul's, the like after 2 years into his kingship, like that's pretty much what we see for the rest of the time Saul's king, is a backwards trajectory from where God wants Israel to go. So Gilgal itself was actually outside the Philistine sphere of dominance, and it had attack routes and it had retreat routes into the nearby hills. So it wasn't really like it had some practicality as a location, but it was more a place to lose a battle than to win one. Like I said, Israel was like, they were as far away from the battle as they could have physically been without crossing the Jordan. Israel and Saul were sort of flinching before they were even hit in this situation. They didn't have a winner's mentality about it, and that reflects their relationship with God and their awareness of His presence. So this shows us how a lack of awareness of God's presence can bleed into our body language and our decision making. Samuel was more important than the burnt offering in this situation. And when Saul gave the offering himself, he was in a sense deciding, or rather following through on a previously made decision based on like where he has his army stationed. He was making a decision to go to war without God. And it was pretty obvious based off of like how he feared his enemy more than he feared God. How often do we go to war without God, though, or think that because we showed up to church and burnt our offering for the week, we sat down and we gave God an hour of our week, that we're in the clear? How often do we do that same thing that Saul did? How often, like Saul, do we feel compelled to move at a pace that's environmentally determined rather than a pace that's God determined? We could even say self-determined, but still, like, how often do we let other people pull our strings and control the way that we move? So doing research for this sermon, there was a commentary that I came across that compared Saul's giving of the sacrifice that he was not supposed to, as likened unto Adam biting the apple. It was quite fascinating. And Samuel's rebuke of him was compared to God's rebuke of Adam in that passage. So this wasn't actually mentioned in the commentary, but it actually made me think additionally about how Saul tried Samuel for arriving late. It made me think of when Adam said to God, like, oh, like the woman that you gave me, he blames God and Eve in the same breath and takes no accountability for his own decisions. And we see a bit of that like Adam nature in all of us, but in Saul in this situation as well. How often are we allergic to accountability? Good question. So another commentary that I came across accused Saul of abandoning his like ethical, like deontological responsibility. And deontology is just sort of like, we don't trade lives. It's the opposite of utilitarianism, which is like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of the trolley dilemma, but like, would you pull a lever and switch a trolley for that was gonna hurt 5 people to then hurt 1 person because less people get hurt? It's trading lives a bit, and so that's sort of the difference between the two. But basically, the commentary was saying that like Saul has an ethical responsibility, and it argued that Saul did what nobody asked him to do, and he failed to do what he was explicitly asked to do. And that's just straight up facts in this situation. He tried to justify it to everybody else. A king playing victim. The habit of playing victim as the king. Don't want to get political, but I will. We kind of have a king who likes to play victim and take no accountability, but that's neither here nor there, nor nor anywhere. So Saul's reasoning, it really falls apart when it's face down with the categorical imperative, which I think sort of piggybacks off of this like deontological argument. And the categorical imperative is basically like Immanuel Kant, who's a philosopher, and he took like the 10 Commandments, and he's like, how do I argue Christianity without using the Bible? And he came up with the categorical imperative, which is another deontological argument. And the categorical imperative is pretty much says, act only to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And in layman's terms, that pretty much means if everybody acted like this, would it be sustainable? If everyone went around and planted a flower, would that violate the categorical imperative? No, because if everybody on Earth did that, the world would be a better place. If everyone went around and kicked a cat, does that violate the categorical imperative? Yes, because if everyone on Earth went around and kicked a cat, like that would just be awful. That would just be awful and unsustainable. That'd be horrible. Even though cats are jerks, we shouldn't kick them. We should not kick them. So yeah, it's yeah. In layman's terms, like if everybody acted like Saul in this situation, making an excuse and being like, "Well, God told me to do this, but like I got scared, so I did this other thing that He didn't ask me to do and justified." If everybody did that, then the whole thing falls apart. And the argument is that like Kant, forgive me, the argument is that Saul is at the top of the dominance hierarchy of Israel. So like his decisions ripple into and you see it, like he's scared, so his army's scared. And so he can't be king. He cannot be king because his decisions reflect the rest of the nation's decisions and what the whole nation's going to do for the most part. So Saul's act as king was so bad, in fact, that he surrendered the right to even be recognized by Samuel after that. And it's interesting because the language when Samuel's mourning over him after they like depart from each other, the word that's used is a ball in the Hebrew, or Abal, Abal, is how you spell it. And it's actually it's used very commonly in the Bible for when one is mourning the dead. So that's how severe he's basically been disowned at this point. It's like that bad, how catastrophic his decision was. So this ordeal with the Philistines, it should convict us because it's not a straw man argument. It's not like it's not an argument it presents the most convincing case for why you wouldn't listen to God, and then Saul is still really wrong. He's about to lose his life. His army's running away. It's been 7 days. Samuel's not here. Like it pretty much makes it as arguable as possible to disagree with God. It makes the best case possible, and it still falls short. And I think that's one of the reasons it should convict us, because the language in the text suggests that the appointed time to wait for Samuel was based on Saul's subjective interpretation, and he only waited the bare minimum time. How often do we do that? How often do we give God the bare minimum of our time to do something? When we pray to God, He either says yes, no, or wait, and I think that sometimes we don't like the wait, and so we treat it like He said yes, or we treat it like He said no, and we end up having a perception of God's opinion and decision on something instead of actually looking and listening to hear and see what He's saying, and we miss it, and then we get ourselves into a whole, I can't think of a thing. We get ourselves into a whole heap of trouble. Put it like that. And this happens when we know of God, but we don't have a trusting relationship with Him in our life. This happens when we think that religion is enough. We misbehave. We sympathize for ourselves. We throw a pity party. We play the victim. And then we tempt others to sympathize for our sin too. So now we're spreading our essence. We're spreading that sin to the people around us. And Saul was going to do that with the whole nation. He did. And he was doing it in that circumstance. So he even archetypically repeats the mistake of taking the Ark of the Covenant into battle, which is like, you'd think Israel would have learned that. And he doesn't just do it with this religious and non-relational offering, which I would argue is a version of taking the Ark of the Covenant into battle. But in his camp was Eli's great grandson, Ahijah, who was a priest, and Ahijah had a priestly ephod with him, which is like a priestly device. I don't really need to go into detail with it, but it was an attempt to force the favor of the Lord. Those two things, kind of like the Ark of the Covenant, between the priestly ephod and Saul doing the offering that he wasn't supposed to do. It was basically a repeat of the Ark of the Covenant being brought to the battlefield, and Israel got their butts kicked because they thought that they could, force God's hand, and they treated God like He was another one of the demons ruling all these other nations. So I've talked a lot about Saul in ancient Israel, Hebrew language, history, and geography. So one might ask, how does all of this apply to modern everyday life? So personally, I like to garden. I've been trying to grow flowers for some time now. And the same thing kept happening. my plants would usually, they grow for a while and then they'd like start to wither and die slowly. And it was really unpleasant to watch. I actually really didn't like it. I almost stopped gardening because of it, because the same thing kept happening. I would plant them, they would wither, and they would die slowly day by day, and I'd have to watch, and I had no idea why. I couldn't explain it. So when I'd see them starting to wither, I'd try to save them and would put more plant food in them, but it was always to no avail. And so one day I was listening to a sermon about the parable of the sower. It was Isaiah Saldivar's sermon. So shout out to Isaiah Saldivar. He's a great preacher. You should check him out. Just search on YouTube Isaiah Saldivar. And he was doing a sermon on the parable of the sower, and in it, he said something that really resonated with me. So I wrote it down on a note and I left it in my living room. Like usual, I'd stopped to later that day. I went down. I stopped to appreciate the flowers. They were at like their prime bloom. They looked super beautiful, and I was just trying to, just stopping to smell the flowers. And I noticed that they were starting to wither again. So at this point, I kind of caught on that like feeding them is in vain, and so I just sort of gave up on them. I was like, you know what? If they're gonna die, just like I'll enjoy them while they last. Then I'll just let them die. And I had actually already surrendered the flowers to God a while ago. I was like, God, these are your flowers. Like, it's not me who's going to take care of them. It's you, but I'll be the manager for them. So surrender your items to God. It's a really useful thing to do. Things go better when you surrender it to God. Your life, your possessions, your reputation, your time, the music that you listen to. I surrendered my car to God because I really like my car. But your life goes better when you surrender your items to God. And so when I surrendered the flowers to God, and I had surrendered them in like verbally, I'd said, God, these are your flowers, I surrender them. But the way that I was behaving, I would freak out every time they were like about to die. And I would like just react instead of respond, and try to save them of my own accord. I don't even think I worried about it too much, to be honest with you. But after I actually surrendered it in my heart, and I was like, you know what? I had an open hand. I was like, if they live, they live. If they die, they die. They're your flowers. I don't know what to do. I give up. After I did that, like at that very moment, actually, the sticky note that I mentioned earlier from the parable of the sower sermon, like fell from the countertop onto the ground. It was like at that very moment. And on it, it read, and this is what I written down on the sticky note. It's not the seed, it's the soil. And I actually I wasn't thinking about the flowers at all when I wrote that down, when I was listening to the sermon. Because I thought that note was about how to handle situations that God puts me in, or how I process my own resistance to correction, or rejection, or to scripture that doesn't tickle my ears the way that I like. Even godly music that I find corny or cheesy, and I'm like, is the music the problem, or is it my taste? Is it, and all those things are true applications of that verse. It's not verse, but of that, line from that sermon. It's not the seed, it's the soil. All of those are true applications of what I just mentioned. Of it being me, the soil that needs to adapt when there's no problem with the seed. But in that particular moment, I thought maybe God's trying to tell me something about the flowers. So I changed their water. I changed the soil. It's an air garden, so it's like an indoor garden. So like changing the soil would be just changing the water. And then, after I changed the water, which is like really laborious, actually, it's kind of takes some work. So I was going to let them die, but I was like, you know what? Doesn't seem to be a coincidence. I'm going to change the water. And when I did that and I fed them again, I was like, I had a different attitude about it. I had a different attitude about feeding them. I didn't do it with panic. I did it. I was in a place of surrender when I did it. And so I was like, let me do everything that I can to try to make this go well. And so I fed them very meticulously according to the measurements on the plant food. And that was when I realized that entire time, every time they started to wither and I decided to feed them when I was supposed to change the water, I was overfeeding them and I was killing them and making them die quicker. And my fearful attempts to keep them alive, trying to hold on to them, was exactly what was killing them. And the day I figured this out, earlier in the day, actually, there was a verse of the day and I didn't understand it. I was like, God, please explain it to me. And then in that moment it clicked. And the verse of the day that on like the YouVersion Bible app was John 11:25, and that verse states, Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And God like really used the flowers to show me what that looked like, because and I'll show you when I'm done recording this, or I might make it the thumbnail in this video or something like that. But like as like the leaves are falling, flowers underneath it, now that they're growing back, there's like new buds growing literally directly underneath petals. So like the flowers died, but because I surrendered them to God and I believed in him, like they're being resurrected, and though they were dead, yet they're going to be alive. And so God used my flowers to show me what this looks like. And I think it's a applicable version of like how when we lay down our life, that's how we gain it a lot of the time, at least with God. So Saul's temptation teaches us what happens when we choose the war, even if it's the war of keeping your flowers alive or whatever it looks like for you, over attentiveness to what an all-capable God will do for those who love, fear, and surrender to him. It was more important that God was worshipped properly than for Israel to survive the war with the Philistines. It was more important that when I surrendered those flowers to God, I honored him rather than trying to take them back from him and make them mine again and control everything about it when I had already said that they were his. It was more important for him to get the worship there than for the flowers to live. And then when I gave him the worship, the flowers came back to life. This was lost on Saul. His heart was after the Philistines, actually, and the validation of his fellow countrymen, as well as his legitimately intimidating rivals. I mean, Saul was contemporaries with Samuel, Jonathan, and later David. So it's not even like Saul's like super insecure around normal people. Like the people who he's like jealous of competition for are genuinely pretty outstanding people. And so this made him unfit to lead, unfortunately, or fortunately, fortunately, unfortunate for him, but fortunate for Israel that God removed him, because what you win them with is what you win them to. And Saul was creating a cult of personality. He was not glorifying God. Saul's men were won to him, not to God. So when he was routed, his troops were routed, and his attention and energy were won by the Philistines and not by God. He was worshiping the Philistines with his fear. He was more afraid of the Philistines than he was of God. That meant that he was more afraid of the Philistines' gods, Dagon, than he was of God. I would actually call that idolatry, because he's giving, fear is like an energy. He's giving that fear to a demon instead of giving that fear to God. How often do we do that? How often are we afraid of situations? And by doing that, you can idolize something through your fear. You can create an idol by being afraid of something, because that fear belongs to God. That's his. So you're taking it away from him and giving it to, you're putting another God before him when you do that. When I do that, I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. So, yeah, it reminded me of the 10 spies that originally scouted the Promised Land back in the book of Numbers. And those 10 spies, when they came back, and that was like Joshua and Caleb were the only ones who didn't do this. Correction, it was 12 spies, but there were 10 of them who were super scared when they saw the Promised Land, because they were looking at themselves in comparison to the giants in the Promised Land rather than the promise that God told them, hey, this is the Promised Land. And I think Saul does the same thing in the situation, because it's sort of a promise. Like Samuel's going to come, he's going to do this thing, and then Saul doesn't believe him, and he's acting like those 10 spies. And just like those 10 spies were kicked out of the were just like all of Israel was kept out of the Promised Land because, everyone believed those 10 spies over Caleb and Joshua. I think the same thing sort of happens with Saul here. He's kicked out of the Promised Land of, his version of the Oval Office, because he fell into the same, he fell for the classic blunder. I still haven't seen The Princess Bride. I gotta watch it. So yeah, Luke, the book of Luke, chapter 17, verse 33 states, whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. So as soon as I surrendered the flowers to God and stopped trying to keep them alive of my own accord, that was the very moment that God provided the solution for their survival. In order to make it in the Christian walk, which is not an easy walk, church on Sundays won't cut it. We have to be willing to literally die for Jesus in order to live free from the slavery that even the king of Israel was ensnared into by his friends and foes alike. To be free, we have to remember that the battle is more in our hearts than it is anywhere else. And it's not so much a battle of what you do, but it's a fight of faith. It's a battle of what you believe. The battlefield is in your heart more than it is on the field. Because that's what it came down to for Saul. You know, he was focused more on the battlefield that was outside instead of what do I think about God versus what do I think about this demon Dagon that my enemies worship. Because he's trying to do a religious ceremony, but he's not doing it out of love for his own God. He's doing it out of fear for like his enemy's God, quite honestly, because he thinks he's going to lose. Yeah. So yeah, to be free, we have to remember that the battlefield is in our heart, and that winning means putting our relationship with Jesus over whatever war effort it is, even if it's just gardening. Even at the cost of our own life, because sometimes it's more than gardening. You know, sometimes the gardening is pushing daisies. So that was a pretty good reference. I'm proud of myself for that. But yeah, even when the cost is our own life, if those are the orders from the Holy Spirit, is to suffer the same fate that Jesus did and to take up our cross and follow him. It's the best path. So when the Father is our God, we have the blessing of knowing that his hand is over us, working all things together for good. It's one of, actually, that's my favorite verse in the Bible. I'll read it for you. It's Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. So when life throws us dying flowers, or like breakups, or we lose our job, or hey, maybe there's a Philistine army outside your window, and the prophet who's supposed to come and save the day is late. Even though God saved the day, but through Samuel was sort of the intention in that situation. But yeah, let's say there's a Philistine army in your backyard, and the prophet's late, whatever that looks like for you, and we're tempted to rout, and we're tempted to make the people around us rout, and we're tempted to play the victim after we've already known God. I would say that in those situations, it helps to get out of those situations. It helps to remember that it's often not the seeds that are the problem. If God's in charge of our lives, then we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us, and he's going to see us through. He's faithful and true. So it's not the seeds that are the problem. I challenge you to think about this. It's not the seeds that are always the problem, but often it's the soil. Often it's our heart posture to whatever God is using to test us at the time. So yeah, I hope this was fruitful for you. Be well. God bless you. I love you.